Expedition 33 was a great game until this point. When Act 3 starts, the game collapses on itself. I want to be very clear here. I really did enjoy this game again until Act 3 started, where the game has massive amount of issues. Now, I also want to be very clear that I'm not talking about the storyline. The story is also very controversial, and I think half hate it, half love it. But this video here is all about the game mechanics. Because the game mechanics are really terrible in Act 3, but it's very clear what it's trying to emulate, what it's trying to copy from old JRPG games, and it fails in every possible way. These are the 5 major points this video will cover. First of all then, battle design. This is a massive issue in Act 3. Even in Act 2, this started to be an issue. Basically, the boss will either one-shot you or you will one-shot them, right? And you farm for like 1 hour and then suddenly you will one-shot them as well. The balance is completely crazy, and basically 90% or even more than that in the Act 3 is just tedious because it's braindead too easy combat where you cannot lose, right? The world design is insanely bad. How you actually travel around and flying and landing and so on. One of the worst I've ever seen in my life. It generally might be the worst RPG I've played in like 20 years because the world design is incredibly bad. And then you have the pictos, which are absurdly bad design in the game. See, this only works right in honestly Act 1 basically, and a little bit Act 2. But in Act 3 you have too many pictos, right? You can just pick out everything. There is no freedom of choice, there's no meaningful choice. You can have all of them. And stacking all the pictos means you can avoid all the game mechanics. Like parrying and dodging is like pointless, because you don't have to do it anymore. And these 3 points together then create this incredibly brain-dead easy combat. Then we have the issues of the pacing of the game. Generally speaking, it is very in Act 3. It's like, here's the open world, kinda, and or the storyline ends. And the order of the dungeons, obviously combined with world design, doesn't make any sense, and it's very strange. The recipe, we went later, but it's very weird. And then of course lastly, the game doesn't actually have almost any actual side content. So of course just boss fights, right, which are all really bad in Act 3, with all the actual good minigames, you know what I mean? So the game is very lacking, and it's by far not a masterpiece. But honestly, if the game had ended on Act 2, I probably would say it's the best game this year. Now, I just feel like the game just got worse because of Act 3. But anyway, let's go into it. We're gonna start off with world design. This here is how Act 3 starts, and where the world design is just utter terrible. First of all, where do I go, right? Everything is just kind of floating all over the place, or you can land maybe on some island, but it's obviously no indication of what is like a level 50 fight, or what is a level 1000 fight, or whatever, right? Nothing here really tells me, is this place strong? Maybe I should land over here instead. Maybe I should go on this thing, right? Maybe it's maybe here, or whatever. Nothing tells me that. It's just random. It's very random. And the problem is that after you have done like one hard dungeon, literally one hard dungeon in Act 3, the rest of the content is far too easy. Okay, you get overleved in this game in like 2-3 hours of playing it, which means that 90% of the content is just terrible after that, which is too easy. And because like I said, it's random, you don't even know what island to go to. Should I go to this fire thing over there, that red island, or should I go to that purple thing, right? So people are coping so hard for this game, saying that, well, it's your own fault. Why did you go to the abyss to begin with? How would I know that's the highest dungeon, you know what I mean? Or the weakest one? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, it's just random. I have no idea, right, what the boss level would be on Sky Island. Should I start here? Or should I go here 10 hours later? Again, I really don't know. There is no indications. A lot of people can say that, yeah, but you go in there, you die or whatever. No, but the problem is that if you go to the wrong dungeon, or any dungeon really, again, you get too powerful for the other dungeons, right? What this game needs so desperately is gating. They need to gate this content. They can just give you all 30 at the same time. See, imagine, right, if you have 30 dungeons, but you have to first do 10 of them, turn out all the 10, right? Then eventually you can unlock the next last 10, okay? that would have made 10 times more sense. Now instead it's like, okay, you get all the 30 immediately, and then you do one of them, and suddenly all the 29 again are too easy, right? That doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, even if you do the easiest dungeons in this game, let's say you do the 5 easiest one, the other 25 will still be too easy. So it's really, really badly designed, because it doesn't make any sense that you out-level the game so vastly. You get way too much equipment, way too many weapons too quickly, right? And no matter how you do it, and I really mean, no matter how you do it, whatever order you do the dungeons in, you are gonna be bored and tedious most of the dungeons. Even after just a few hours, I felt that I was just doing the dungeons, just, you know, because I guess I keep playing them, but they got boring because I'm like one-shotting all the mobs and most of the bosses too, right? See, talking about more later in the video, but people also keep defending this game saying that you're only playing Maelle, right? Oh, she's so powerful. No. Maelee is doing like 1 million AoE damage per turn, so it's like after just 3 hours. So I'm like, no, it's like everything. So over here, as an example, this here is called the Reacher. This is a dungeon. My point is that this dungeon could have been much higher level. Why is it here? The enemies here are as easy as the Skyline or whatever, right? Why? This is gated. This is slightly relationship gated. These enemies here should have been like 20 levels higher. You should have many different steps how to unlock the different dungeons, right? I believe it goes so far to say this game that flying should have been unlocked in Act 2. You should have had flying in the end of Act 2, and again then obviously have maybe had like 5 to 10 or so dungeons, right, to do in Act 2 then, right? And then obviously then the other dungeons will be unlocked by knowing the truth in Act 3. For example, the Reacher, you wouldn't be able to go there unless you have the full Maelle relationship kind of thing, right? That would make a lot more sense. Now, it does of course not end here either when it comes to the bad design of this game's world. So you find bosses like this, right? They're standing all over the place. And I understand very much what the game is going for, right? It's a very common trope, especially like Dragon Quest games, Solo Mad, whatever, right? That you have these like secret bosses that are standing around in the game world. This game though does it in a very bad way, because there are too many of them. And that sounds like a weird complaint, where there's too many world bosses. Like, why is like 20 of them? The thing is that if you look at old games, for example, this is Ruby Weapon, one of the 2 bosses on the map in FF7. Those are Emerald Weapon. There are 2 of them. And yes, you will run into them, and you will get owned, and it's fun. You remember that, you come back later, and you defeat them, right? That is a good game experience. That is clearly what 3 is going for. Problem again, 3 has like 30 of these guys. And it's completely random if they're level 10 or level 10,000, right? You run into like 5 of those guys, and you wonder, wait, should I stop doing this thing? But the other ones are easy. It doesn't make much sense. It's not that memorable, and it's just kind of like not interesting. It's just tedious instead. Like, when am I supposed to turn to this island to fight the 11 chromatic guy that this island had? It is incredibly hard to know. So what happens, similar to the dungeons, right, in this game, is that first you meet a bonus boss here, right? He defeats you one attack. Oh, this is too guys, it's too hard. You go away, you level up a bit, you return, 10 hours later, and you one-shot him, right? It's not fun. The game basically doesn't work if it's not linear, right? The game actually is by far the best in Act 1. There is no exploration in this game, no discoverability. You can see the giant portal a mile away. There is never any question in this game where I'm supposed to land. There is nothing here. I can see that, right? This is where the door is. Actually, in old school JRPG games, you wouldn't know where to land. You wouldn't know that you're supposed to run here, or you're supposed to run over there, or maybe something up here, you cannot land here perhaps. No, this game is very, very rigid. It's kind of funny actually. People keep saying that, oh, Ubi slop, was proven wrong by this guy that left them. But this to me is a very much an Ubisoft game. Here, for example, in Dragon Quest 8, right, you have to know where to land. You have to try and actually land on different cliffs or whatnot. And this specific cliff here then is where you land to find metal slimes, right? This is important. This is discoverability. Nothing in the world tells you this is where you're supposed to land, right? Nothing here, you have to discover it yourself. So now you find a secret dungeon, right, to find specific enemies to encounter. In this case then, in the quest, these are the XP, high XP enemies, the meta slimes. Let's talk about the actual balance issues then, right? So the game has tremendous balance issues in the game. It is of course a combination of just how the scaling in the game doesn't make any sense, how Act 3 just lets you level up insanely fast, and also then obviously talk about the world design and coming to later equipment, right? But first of all then, the issue in Act 3 is that you will start one-shotting everything after just a few hours. Suddenly you will do insane damage, and it doesn't matter anymore, right? Because you can just attack them like 3-4 times to kill them on attack, and I don't really have to care about things. So look at this, okay. Yep. Okay. Do a double attack, you know, bada bam, right? She's dead. Now I can go in here. This is the best ability, right? This is a random ability, bada bam, she's dead, that thing is dead. And you can say that, oh, but this is clearly under-leveled. You purposely picked a dungeon now where the enemies are, you know, too weak or whatever, right? But how would I know that? First of all, right? Talking about earlier, I don't know that. When I went, for example, to the Reacher dungeon, and I was already like, I think like 20 or maybe 30 levels too high for that dungeon. So that's of course combined with the whole world issues, right? But the thing is that the game just scales really weird after Act 2. Even in Act 2, you are starting to get far too powerful. Obviously I play with expert, I had to say that, but it's also an expert, right? The thing is that when you get to the last boss in Act 2, right? I got to kind of under-leveled, and I couldn't beat the boss the first attempt. Okay, I was like, that's pretty hard. Then I went and did all the side content, especially the frozen place. After I killed this frozen boss and the yellow dungeon then, I was now vastly over-leveled for the last Act 2 boss. So I went from being like maybe 5 to 10 levels too low for that boss, right? Did this dungeon, and suddenly I'm like, what, 10 plus or maybe 15 levels too high or something, and I could almost one-shot the Act 2 boss. So the game has wacky bad balance design even before Act 3, right? And all of this thing is massively extended into Act 3. So in Act 3, you basically, let's say start level 55 then, right? And if you do like 1 or 2 dungeons, you get to like level 75 or 80 or whatever immediately. So now suddenly, like I mentioned earlier, half dungeons is like 50 or 60, you can be way too powerful. It just doesn't make any sense, like straight up, right? Another problem, of course, is that you will find weapons far, far too easy. So in the game, you have weapons that go from like level 1 to 33, 34 max level, and immediately, in the second dungeon I did, I'm finding like level 30 weapons, and I have like level 15 to 20 weapons, right? So I have like 3 or 4 times the damage output in like 10 minutes with all the characters, right? And I want to be very, very, at this point here, that people keep copying saying that it's only because you're using Stendhal with Maelle, right? No. Every character can easily do like 1,000,000 damage after just a few hours in Act 3. Monoko can do 1,000,000 damage easily the first turn. Loon can do 1,000,000 damage AoE easily in Act 3 after just a few hours. Every character gets brokenly overpowered way too quickly, right? Obviously the enemies can't handle that. If you actually gave all the enemies like 10 times more health points than the bosses, you actually would probably have a much better gameplay, right? Overall though, the problem with the game is very clear, right? This part here was enjoyable to play. It wasn't too hard, but it actually mattered, right? It mattered when I avoided. It mattered to dodge and to parry. This have actually mattered still, right? The game system of parrying and dodging are almost completely obsolete in Act 3. It's only the super boss where it matters. People are gonna cope and say, oh, what about that Simon guy? Yeah, you're right. On the super boss it matters. But there's one fight out of like 100 fights. 99% of Act 3 parrying and dodging doesn't matter anymore because you're so powerful, right? It's not fun. The game in Act 1 and Act 2 is fun to play, right? Because it is linear, because it has to have a scaling, because of the lack of gating, because of the lack of a systematic level and enemies actually being remotely close to you in level, right? In Act 3, to somewhere there, it doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter anymore if you actually follow the game rules, right? I do get some people gonna say that isn't that the same thing for whatever Dragon Quest, Fantasy, Breath of Fire, whatever, right? Not really. The old school JRPG games tended to be much better again, scaled, better paced, right? Comment to later more pacing. But basically, let's give it like Secret of Mana. So in Seiken Densetsu 3 or Secret of Mana 2 then, you can fight these different mana beasts in any order you want, except the dark one. Spoiler, he's the last one. The other 7 you can do in any order you want, right? But these 7 guides, what do they do? They actually scale to your level, right? To some extent. Not exactly, but if you kill this one, the next one will get stronger, right? So you can pick an order, depending on the class you use in the game, which makes it easier to pick the fire one if you're ice magic and so on, right? And earlier in the game, when you get to the ice region, you can actually decide ice or fire first. But the moon region can only be faced after beating both ice and fire, right? So you have the meaningful choice of picking what boss should I first do, right? Again, depending on what class you're playing with, obviously it's always easier or harder, right? But the moon boss, which is a very hard boss in the game, will always be hard, right? Because there the game side has assumed that, oh, you have beaten both ice and fire before you get to me, right? This is typical gating and makes perfect sense, right? I mean, it's just so basic. 33 doesn't even do this thing, right? Again, 33 is like, yes, you have Simon, the very last super boss in the game, and that's fair, he's strong, right? But basically all the bosses between that, they don't care about this stuff, right? At all. So you either get far too hard bosses, because you suddenly go into like a level 85 boss or level 10 or whatever, right? Or you are 85 when you meet a level 10 boss. That's the feeling of Expo 33. You're like, oh my god. And again, right, I want to iterate that point. 33 was really fun to play it in Act 1 and Act 2, mostly again because it was linear, right? Yes, you had swimming in Act 2, and that wasn't that good either, of course, in Act 2, but the issues that Act 3 has, obviously, is Act 2 as well, right? But it's less of an extent, right? So you have a much more, clean fighting, because I do enjoy playing 33 when it comes to parrying and dodging, right? But again, it doesn't matter anymore when you get to Act 3. And the reason why is, of course, also the equipment. Let's talk about that. This system here is good, okay? I like the pictos system in Act 1. Even in Act 2, it's starting to get a little bit wonky. In Act 3, it's just insane, right? The reason are two-folded. First of all, the lack of meaningful choices. So while you can have 3 of them on the same time, and you hit them over here, right, for pay points, right? This point system gets completely wacko because you keep getting so many points, right? Normally in a game, you'll be limited to having, let's say, 10 out of these 100 choices, right? But in this game, because you keep getting more and more luminas, you eventually can just have like 50 different passes on you, right? So there's no meaningful choice there. I'm just gonna pick everything eventually, right? This is like, again, halfway through Act 3 here, and I have so many of me already, right? So many of them, and it's just like, there's so many, and I have like half of them already. This is crazy. Like, this is no choices here, really. Because some of them are terrible, right? So I'm gonna pick 10% you can just throw away immediately. And then you have all this incredibly broken one, like double turning, extra AP, extra damage, triple attacks, whatever. So you can do like 6 attacks, turn 1, and you can do 3 immediate damage, whatever. And I understand the conceptual idea to get, oh, I'm broken, oh, it's so fun to mix builds or whatever. But actually, I don't find designing my character build this game fun at all. Because again, I have too many points, right? There is no limitations. It should be like you can only have 10 passes, whatever. This game would be so much better if it limited you, right, to only having a few passes. Of course, you have to scale that. So again, in Act 1, it actually works the best, right? Because you have a few passives, you can only pick a few of them. So you have like 10 of them, you can only have maybe like, let's say, 5 of them, right? And then you can have maybe a few more. And then you have like 40, you can have maybe like, 15 or whatever. But again, in Act 3, you're gonna have like, Jesus Christ, you're gonna have like 50, 60 passes on you. And again, it's no meaningful choice, because you can just pick all of them. Eventually in Act 3, you have all, right? That's not fun. That's not a build. I used to have all of them. Why wouldn't I just pick all of them? Because I have so many points. Like, it's not actually intellectually good at all. And it gets worse, right? So first of all then, no meaningful choices, right? Okay. Side note, a lot of the passives are incredibly much better for the same point system. This is bad design overall. Bad design. But I digress. Now, the worst thing is that everything stacks here like crazy. And at first, again, it's fun. I get so broken. But no, it breaks the game system. Because if you can both have like cheater, unlike the turn, right? Double attack, and this thing, and crit, and this thing, and dead, and blah blah. You're gonna have like so many passives that gives you like 4 attacks in one turn, immediately have full 9 out of 9 AP, right? Plus like 9 shields immediately, and you can do like 1,000,000 damage as soon as the fight starts, and you will just one-shot all the enemies before they do anything. So in Act 3, but honestly, even in Act 2, right, the pictos start ruining the actual gameplay. So for example, right, we play on Expert, you will die on most boss attacks in one attack, right? But immediately in Act 2, you will find this pictos, that you have 3 shields on you, but half life points. Half life points, whatever counts, right? So now you will survive 4 attacks from the boss. Obviously then you have to not really learn how to parry and dodge anymore. However, it gets worse. You have this passive that gives the other characters 3 pictos when you die, right? So now everyone has 9 actual shields per fight, right? Because this character dies, the other gonna get that to 6, the other dies. So it's like, okay, so they have a lot of shields now. So it doesn't really matter parrying dodge anymore. And it gets even worse. Because you can have both survivor, so you revive automatically, and there's another revive thing, and then when you actually die, you gave everyone AP and get buffed and so forth, right? So it becomes this ridiculous thing where a character can have like, oh, I start with like 3 sheets, then I get 6 more sheets before I die, and if I die, I auto-revive twice, and then when I finally die, everyone gets like AP and burn into the enemy, and I explode, and then I get more AP when I'm revived, and you can revive with Loon, because 5 AP, but she gets like 9 AP for reviving someone, and also the other guy gets like 9 AP. So you will have basically every character with 9 AP, right, constantly, in every turn, so you can do like 1,000,000 damage every goddamn turn, and you know, and you can survive like, I don't know, like 12 attacks before you die or something, and when you finally die, the other guys get like powered stats. And you can have these passives that before you die, you get like 1 extra turn basically. So you have 2 turns all the time. You get an extra turn before you die, right? And it happens, and so forth and so forth and so forth. Like, this isn't actually fun. It does sound like, oh, it's amazing, I can have these cool builds. But no, you basically just have an issue where you have so many passives that have more or less the same stacking, right? So for example, one passive is that every time you attack, you get an extra AP, right? Okay. Another passive is that when I get an AP, I get 2 instead of 1. Okay. Those 2 stacks, of course. So now I'm getting like 3 AP per attack, right? Then another passive is I do 2 attacks. Now I'm getting 6 AP per attack. It's just like all of this is just way too much of the same thing. And the game even has like here where you have any guessing attack 1, 2, like they have the exact same thing. It just costs more, points, right? So you get like, oh, I get 8 AP now when I attack, right? And I have 2 turns always. So the first turn, I can get all my AP, and I can do 1,000,000 damage immediately in the second part of Act 1. It's just a really weird system. Like I said earlier, in Act 1 it makes sense, because you don't have that much color of lumina, right? After a few hours in Act 3, you're gonna have like 100, 200 more lumina, and you can just make a character like incredibly powerful, right? And I wanna very much point it out here, this image here is when I'm like in the beginning of Act 3, you know what I mean? I haven't even got all the items yet. Yeah, I haven't even got all the items yet, right? Like I'm gonna have 5 so much more Lumina later, but I'm actually gonna go into and farm the game, right, and do all the bosses or whatnot, right? So already at this point, you're too powerful. And my point then is that this is like playing Act 3 for like 3 hours, and I'm already way too powerful, right? As I mentioned earlier, because of the weird world level design thing, I'm already out-leveled almost everything except that one super boss, right? And people really love to cope with saying that, where the last super boss, he can like remove your shields, so this build is terrible or this doesn't make through. But who cares? All the other thing is pointless in the game. It's tedious now, right? I just have to summarize here that it's these 3 things combined, right? Terrible world design, really strange this overall balance thing where, again, the character vastly out-levels. You probably, like, just straight up, would be a better game if you, like, half the XP you get or whatever, right? Something like that, whatever. And so forth. Just how the enemies doesn't scale with you. It's no gating and so on, right? And then you get into this, like I mentioned, all these passives. And also, for that matter, the weapons has passive too, right? So Loon, for example, can have an ice weapon on her. They will also save her for 1 death. She can have like 3 auto-revives in the beginning of Act 3 immediately. And also get more AP when you auto-revive. So you're like, oh, okay, so I can like 3 times, have 9 plus shields, and blah, blah, blah. So all that's combined, right, I keep saying, means that I can basically completely ignore parrying and dodging in Act 3. except of course on like that very last boss. But every other boss in the game is irrelevant now, right? Final Fantasy 16. This game is brain dead too easy, right? The problem with this game is not that it's not turn-based. The problem is that I can just press any random button and avoid the enemy, and I will do like, 55 attacks to the enemy before they can hurt me. How fun is that? You know what I mean? The issue is not that it's not turn-based, the issue is it's too easy, it's brain dead, right? This game is only fun in the beginning, and after you play it for a few hours, you're far too powerful compared to the enemies, and that removes the engagement for the player. I don't have to avoid it anymore. This is Act 3 after 3 hours in 33. This is the same thing as FF16. It's the exact same issue, fundamentally. The game now is far too easy, right? I can avoid the game mechanics. I don't have to actually care about the game mechanics. Look at the damage I can do right now. This is genuinely after 3 hours of the game. And this is insane. It's far too easy. The only difference with 16 and 33 in a sense is that with 16, right, it happens basically after Act 1 in the game, right? It's 2 even earlier. But they have the glaringly same fundamental issue. After just a few hours into like the next grinding step, right, I'm just so powerful now that I don't have to dodge anymore. I don't have to parry anymore. I don't really have to care what combos I do, whatever, or, I just shoot at the boss, and like my basic attack is like taps of his life points, you know what I mean? Like, it's insane. Like, where's the gameplay in this? This is tedious. The structure and the pacing of the storyline, or rather, the side storyline as well, that in Act 3 is also terrible, okay? And you might say I'm cheating now. You said no storyline. No, but I mean, I'm not gonna talk about the actual storyline, the actual events. I'm just talking about how it's presented, right? How it's phased into the game in different, intervals or whatever. Okay, fine. I'm not gonna show them this scene here because I don't wanna spoil it or whatever. But basically, this is a relationship scene. But like the first two you get pretty quickly. And then it's like a huge, distance between the other ones. And then suddenly you have unlocked all 4 of them immediately. So you have to just sit there and spam it, right? So I felt it was very unnatural. You probably maybe can do it better. But again, this is where it comes to the whole randomness in the game and like the UI or whatever. I didn't know exactly when I had unlocked, like the 3rd scene or 4th scene or whatever. Suddenly the game just told me that you have all of them now. So I was like, okay. So in Act 3 I just did all of them immediately. Some of them are gated though for Act 3. And overall it feels badly paced, okay? And it gets worse because the last one of them, for some of the characters, will unlock a dungeon, okay? So I like that in the conceptual idea that gives you that, I call it gating, right? Example, the Reacher, it's a gated one. You have to talk to a character in the camp 5 times to get that dungeon. Okay, that makes sense, you know what I mean? But the game doesn't really explain this thing. So it's really weird too. If you go to the Reacher before you have this scene then, the game will say not now. Again, that's weird pacing. It's not like, why can't I enter this dungeon when I have flying? And the game also gives you no tips or hints for it, right? In older, better games, they will tell you that, oh no, I'm afraid of heights, or, or it's ice or whatever, right? This game gives you no indication, again, how to open that thing, or how it's linked, or who is linked to in your party or whatever, right? And I found that just bad. It might be nitpicky, I would say it's nitpicky, but I think it's just bad, right? It also combines, as I mentioned earlier, with the world level design having no actual puzzles, right? There's never that I have to like go to a city, an NPC or whatever. He will explain to me how to open this like ice puzzle or whatever. And then I have to go to the world map and like fly 3 times around this ice thing to make it melt something or whatever, right? That thing never happens. You have to just go to this giant portal, right? So it's very strange, and again, it feels weirdly structured, where you don't actually really go back to, for example, any of the NPC cities in the game. When you unlock the last city in the game, right, that's a dungeon instead. There's no like pacing like that. So the game just overall feels weirdly paced, and in Act 3 then, of course, coming from 2, is very off-putting, because like I mentioned earlier, of course, you have the whole world map, right? Hits you in the face with this giant world map, and then you have the storyline that is one place next to you. So you literally have the closest dungeon where you start in Act 3 is the actual only storyline dungeon left, one of them, right? And then the rest of them are just bonus side content, whatever, right? And that to me is very strange. That again could have been, of course, better paced, better structured, right? For example, these scenes, let's have it with Loom that unlocks a dungeon with her, right? That could have been part of the storyline. Before you have to fight the last boss, you have to do these 4 extra, story dungeons, right, per character, one or something like that, or the order of it. Now it's just very strange. It's just like, oh, there's the last final dungeon next to me, and maybe I do all the stuff, right? And like I mentioned earlier, I think the game would be a lot better if they had flying in Act 2. If you had put a few of the dungeons in Act 2, some of them being actually, like storyline driven, you have to do them, and a few of them being like extra stuff, right? Then in Act 3, you gate and you up a few more dungeons, right? Maybe then you unlock these dungeons for like Loon and Maelle and so on, right? You do those, and then you fight the last boss, right? That would be a much better structure instead of having this like giant just hit you in the face with just everything at the same time. And again, there is no really like back and forth either. I think it's very, very strange, because you go to like a dungeon and you beat some boss there, and there's nothing like, you never pick up anything that you have to give to someone, like an NPC or someone at camp or whatever. It just feels weird. Like, I never feel engaged to actually go anywhere in the game, except that, oh, it's a flying rock over there, I have to go there, I guess, because of game mechanics. But it's not like, why am I going there? It feels very, very gamey, and it's very disconnected from the actual storyline or the actual characters. Again, I don't want to go into too much of the storyline here, because I'm trying to not make a story video, but it gets worse too, because the characters, right, in the last relationship gated parts, right, are not really discussing what is happening in Act 3. They're still acting like it's Act 2, like they don't know the actual truth now of the game. It's only one scene that makes kind of sense to me, and the rest of the game, it feels like it's weirdly put, basically. Like, that should have been probably way earlier in the game, and it should be later or something. It just feels very strange, all of it's combined, right? And it's also partially true for Act 2 as well, but it's just slightly better in Act 2, and because it's slightly less stuff to go to and slightly less confusing or whatever. And also, of course, to some extent, because you do not know the storyline yet in Act 2, it just, you can accept it, right? I think, without spoiling the storyline, when you know the truth, so to speak, it also makes less sense what they're doing, right? It feels more disjointed, like you have this storyline, then you have this game mechanics that actually don't match together at all. And it just feels a very weird structural pacing. So I don't think the storyline is good, this is either, honestly. Again, I'm not critiquing the actual story, I'm saying how the story is presented to you, right? The structure of it, the tempo of it, in Act 1 and Act 2 and so on, how it's actually into it. One thing I will say though, without going into the storyline, but still, what I think is a fair critique as well for Act 3, is that I found the storyline incredibly obvious too, okay? I felt it was very, very predictable, right? So when Act 3 finally starts, you're kind of like, yeah, that's kind of expected, right? I think that also kind of ruins the pacing, because in Act 2, there is far too much like obvious like foreshadowing that makes it very, very clear what's going to happen in, generally speaking, in the end of Act 2. And that's, again, actually a structural issue, right? Where the game puts too much emphasis on basically revealing stuff to you. So you finally get to Act 2 into Act 3, you finally beat like, the gating, so to speak. You feel like, oh, it's finally here, because you kind of wait for too much of it in Act 2. So I think that also lowered the quality of Act 2, right? Because Act 2 spends too much time emphasizing on stuff that you already know, right? So it's a lot of these, I would say, like structural issues in the storyline, without, again, addressing what's actually in the story, but how it's presented to you. Now, lastly, all the side content in the game is just terrible, right? All the Gestalt stuff is just really, really low quality. It's buggy, it's janky, it's a very boring, not fun gameplay or whatnot, right? A lot of people are gonna cop and say, oh, you have to do it optional or whatever, right? And I'm not gonna address it too much in this video here, because it could be its own video, but the problem with the game is that the only side content the game has, basically, right, is the dungeon fights, right? It is the, in Act 3, you have the typical, end game content, but the only end game content you actually have, again, right, is these dungeons, which, because of the terrible world design, are not structured or paced correctly either, right? So you have this bunch of random boss fights, which most of them are just boring, because it's too powerful, of course. And then you have nothing else, right? Because you have these really shitty minigames that everyone hates, and you can do them in a few minutes. This isn't that hard. It takes like, 5 minutes and it's over, right? And calling this game a masterpiece and comparing it to like FF10 or whatever, you're like, that game had Blitzball. Blitzball was like a 20-hour really fun game experience on the sideline, right? Blitzball was great in endgame content, because you could recruit other players and build your new teams, and the game would actually evolve. We're in this game, it's just like, okay, so nothing of this extra side content really matters for the game. The awards are pointless, right? And that to me is a mistake, honestly. I prefer if you actually have, useful stuff in the minigames. But even if you ignore that, it's just not fun, right? The minigames aren't fun. Now, like I said, they can be on video, but it gets worse, right? Because there's also like real no purpose to go to any NPCs in this game. I mentioned it earlier briefly, but I mean, do I like fly back to some village? Do I, explore some new place with some side quest or whatever, where I get some other stuff to do with some characters on the side? No, because the game basically almost only have, these like main characters, right? And that also is a big blunder. It reminds me of FF13, right? FF13 has some issues clearly as well. It was hated by a lot of people. One reason people hate 13 was because you had these like 1 or 2, I suppose, cities that you went to, right? And then you could never return there. So you had like the city, and after you beaten the storyline or half the storyline, you couldn't go up again. So in that game, so to speak, end game content, that game's Act 3, or rather Act 2 in that game, whatever you point, Act 3 in that game, you couldn't return to the NPCs. You couldn't return to like the minigames or whatnot, right? Which was very weird, right? Because in the old FF games, like 10 and 9 and 7 and whatever, right? You can go back to all the previous cities, and the stuff to do there is interaction, there's story bits, there's side quests, it's minigames, they're actually fun, so forth, right? In this game, it's a very empty world, right? When you in Act 3, sure, you can go and like fight the Gestalt village guy, right? That's like a boss fight. It's just another core gameplay feature. Basically, there is nothing in this game that is not a core gameplay feature, except these like incredibly bad minigames that you can beat in a few minutes, right? And that is extremely not comparable to games like, I don't know, DQ8, DQ11, where you have this monster farming, right? Or whatnot. There's so much other game stuff like that. Plus the NPCs, the cities, the exploration. This game doesn't have actual exploration because you can see everything on the map. There's nothing to hide there, nothing to find there. It's just there. So it really lacks any kind of like meaningful side content. Side content, when it comes to purely being the same core gameplay loop of ergo the fighting in this game, is not the same thing as having all that other stuff, right? And like I said, that's why people didn't like 13 too much. 13 also only had fightings, right? 13 was a really good combat design, much better than this game. And it was just incredibly fun to fight in that game. But same as this game, when you got to its end act, it only had fighting, right? You know what I mean? And then they made 13.2, which had a huge amount of cities and side content and mini games and bunch of exploration and puzzles and yada yada yada. And that was an answer, right? Because everyone complained on 13 not having all that stuff they expected to have. The problem, of course, with this game, though, if I summarize it, is that, okay, so in its end act of Act 3, it only has more boss fights, basically. Yes, it has one more Gestalt minigame, which is terrible, but whatever, you get point. It has only more fights, okay? Nothing really to discover, you run around, you find this music, whatever, but it's just boring, okay? So nothing there. Then, the extra fighters then are ruined, right, by this, insanely bad balance of the levels and items you get for that. Okay, so the extra side content, so to speak, the boss fights, are not engaging whatsoever, because they're too easy. So the whole of Act 3 is basically just boring and tedious after just a few hours, because you get too powerful, too many stuff, and there's nothing else to do there. Right? I mean, like I said, in other games, you might have the same issue, that the fights are too easy, right? The actual core gameplay gets too easy, and then in that sense tedious. But maybe you have all these really interesting narrative side quests, right? Maybe you have really good minigames, which are really enjoyable, like for example Blitzball, so you can play instead, right? Or both or whatever. But it's like, in this game, you don't have that. It doesn't have that, to be honest here. It only has the extra fights, and the extra fights are not good. The only extra fight that is interesting is, of course, the classic super boss, right? But that doesn't make the rest of it fun, because that's like 1% of the fights, right? And yeah, that is somewhat challenging, but actually not really either, okay? I know people are saying, you're saying that we die, no, the thing is that, no, okay? the last support in this game is nothing comparable to many other was in other games either. Because there's one thing this game actually lacks, if you talk about the pure combat in this game, is actually strategy, right? You know what I mean? This game is hard in the beginning of the game, Act 1, and part of Act 2 on Expert, because you have to parry and dodge, right? Looking into this combat system, I do find it very much used like, yeah, it is soulslike turn-based, right? But it's no strategy. And I find it kind of sad too, because a lot of people are saying that, oh, this is our, reawakening of turn-based game, yada yada, right? But in actuality, it isn't, because this game doesn't really make a good turn-based game. Again, I actually really like the combat in this game. Don't get me wrong, I like it, right? But I don't like it because it's a strategy game. I don't like it because it has interesting, turn-based activation, right? It's not as, how to say it, there are much better tactically turn-based JRPGs. Much, much better. This game has a good take on the whole dodging thing, but it doesn't give me that feeling of always tactical or whatever. So in that sense, right, even the last super boss in this game I find kinda meh, honestly. I mean, it's hard, took me a few attempts, right? But it's more in that Elden Ring or whatever feel to, right? Obviously the last boss is just the Helge tree or whatever, so it's obviously cheating on it, but it's the Earth tree or whatever, I get in there. But basically it's only hard because I have to learn, the dodge and parry pattern, right? It's not hard because of my strategy or something like that. So it doesn't really capture, actually, I would say, the essence of most classic JRPGs. It really doesn't. That's not a video game later, perhaps, but I just find it very strange too, because people are basically like, oh, it's the best turn-based game ever. I would say this is more like an take on, like a slow fighting, wind-upping boss fights like in Elden Ring. That's how the games feel. It's that kind of combat. It's more like this game, honestly, to me, is more like a real-time game that goes really slow instead of a turn-based game requiring you to dodge. This is much more like a real-time, like action RPG, like Dark Souls, Elden Ring, or whatever, right? Sekiro, yeah, that requires you to parry. It's not much of a turn-based game, because turn-based games tend to, of course, be much more strategic, more tactical focused, right? And of course, obviously, that also is a general issue in Act 3. If the game actually was more tactical, it was more focused on having the correct strategies in the fights, right, it wouldn't be as easy just to get incredibly overleveled and then ignoring them. Because, of course, as I mentioned earlier, in this game now, when you get so powerful, you have all these mechanics that makes you ignore stuff like parrying. I mean, it's good to die, right? When you have enough pictos, if you die, you get everyone gets 20 buffs, right, basically. So it's better to die, and then you let your character die, so you can do more damage for the characters. Except, of course, from the last final boss then, right? But everything else, that's how it works. So you basically get I can just ignore the game mechanics. Again, if this game was more tactically based, you wouldn't be able to do that. It would have better loot. You have to stay follow the tactics, right? This game then actually being an action RPG that is slow down, right? You if you get too much health, whatever, you can ignore it. So it feels very much like I'm playing Elden Ring, and I have all the points in vitality. You know what I mean? I have the best gear in the game, and I can just tank the last boss, Malenia, and just ignore her ability because I'm so incredibly tanky. That's kind of how the game actually fits in Act 3. You're just too tanky, right? And also, like I said earlier, last point here is that people keep defending this game, saying that, oh, you were only so powerful because you Stendhal and Maelle, generally speaking. That's a complete lie, right? Every character in this game gets way too powerful. Most, like I mentioned earlier, because the whole you're stacking all the passes, right? So no, every character can do 1,000,000 damage in one turn, each turn, every turn, and it's very important to remember that. There's no bullshitting like, oh, it's only this character. No, all the characters are too powerful. And lastly, on that point, and it's kind of funny too, because I have seen people defend that by saying that, well, it's your fault for using the abilities or the items, And I'm like, oh yeah, so sure, I should play the game without using any passives or any weapons or any characters' abilities. That gets hard, but that's the most dumbest thing ever. But yes, any game is hard if you refuse to use any of the game mechanics, right? It is hard to play Mario if you can't jump anymore, you know what I mean? That's kind of like saying that, yeah, you have to Super Mario, but you can't use the jump button. It's like, yeah, okay, so I will die every time. Yes, you will. So what's a good game, right? It's like, no, it is silly. Anyway, if you like the video, guys, please subscribe, press the like button. I might do another video then about the combat system more in detail. Perhaps this was a part of it, right? But also maybe on the storyline. And the storyline for me is, I don't know. I mentioned earlier, right? I think the biggest issue for me actually is that it was too predictable. To me, the controversy with Act 3, I agree with it, partially definitely, but to me it was actually probably worse. I guessed it. I guessed correctly before I even got there. I don't find the game being that mysterious. I think the art of the game is great, right? And the music great and so forth, but I was doing get tricked by this like allure of the storyline. And obviously I knew what character was gonna, for Act 1 because that's the same character in another Square game. So I was like, well, it's gonna be exact same storyline, and it was. So I was like, yeah, okay. The game to me has copied far too much, right? So if you're like me that has played the previous games that know what they're copying, I could see Act of N1 a mile away because I've seen the exact same scene basically in older games from Squaresoft. So I was like, yeah, okay, it's that scene. You know what I mean? But anyways, have a great day.